8 years ago, when photographer Dan Habib became a father to Samuel, he didn't realize that advocating for his son with cerebral palsy would change the course of his life and career. Following Samuel's struggles to walk and talk and be included at school and in the community became the subject of his documentary, Including Samuel. Here's a clip.
My name is Dan Habib. My wife Betsy and I have two boys, Isaiah and Samuel.
Take a bow. Okay.
And joining me right now is the creator of that film, Dan Habib. Thank you so much for joining us. It is a very, very riveting film. For those of us who don't necessarily know the school system, what is inclusion?
Right. Well, inclusion starts with the family, and in this film it really starts with looking at how, as a family, we've tried to include Samuel in everything we do. Not just school, but at community, recreational programs, and it's kind of like at the dinner table you don't have a seat for Samuel off on the side. He's part of our family.
Right. And so, is it only those with challenges that benefit from inclusion?
Right. Well, inclusion, the way I see inclusion kind of in the educational system is that kids, the assumption is that kids are going to be in a typical classroom all the time with the proper supports to make them successful. And it doesn't mean that every kid needs to be in the classroom every second, but what it means is by having that sense of diversity in the classroom, because disability is part of diversity, just like ethnic diversity and racial diversity, you create a society where that's accepted as the real world. And kids need to understand this is the real world.
Right.
Kids with disabilities and adults with disabilities will be living and working alongside them.
Especially when we grow up to become adults, and team efforts are so important.
Right.
In the film, it's not just Samuel you talk
Right.
about, you other characters, Nathaniel, Emily. They all have disabilities. How did you learn from their experiences, and what did their challenges sort of bring to the table when you think about inclusion, when you think about, you know, trying to build community and family?
Sure. One of the people in the film was Keith Jones, who's a hip-hop artist and social activist in Boston. And what I learned from him, he's an adult, and looking back, his parents really pushed for inclusion at a time when it was not very typical for it to be happening. So I learned that as a parent, we really need to advocate hard for our child. And actually, we went through a leadership program through the University of New Hampshire Institute on Disability that taught us to be advocates for Samuel through the health system, the educational system. It was like a boot camp for disability rights. And then I learned from someone like Joe Pedner, who's the principal at Haggerty School, one of the elementary schools I focus on, that the leadership has to start from the top. It has to be from administrators, superintendents, and they really need to show that schools have the will to do this.
Right.
Because more important than any financial supports or technological supports is a community's will to make this work.
What do you say to folks who think that individuals with disabilities should be in their own space because perhaps they will get the kind of teaching and nurturing that they need?
I say that in most cases that's the path of least resistance for schools, but it's not the best thing for the student or the larger community, because most kids, if they're in a typical classroom, first of all, they're being taught by teachers who are the experts, not special educators, even though I have a lot of respect for them as well. They're learning all the social skills that they need to learn by being around their peers, and their peers are learning that this is the real world and that they develop a sense of compassion and patience that they wouldn't have otherwise. Samuel's classmates are very patient with the way he communicates because he has cerebral palsy, so it's slow. So a few weeks ago, a child from Burundi moved in as a refugee. They knew that they needed to communicate more patiently with that child. And what happens when their grandparent has a stroke or develops Alzheimer's, they realize, okay, Poppy's now communicating in a different way, we need to be patient. So these kids really are enriched by the experience of being around that diversity.
It sounds like Samuel's experience, both by virtue of your family and the school community, is a very nurturing one. I think of schools here in New York City, and I can only imagine the viciousness. Have you ever thought, oh my gosh, one day Samuel may come home in tears because someone was really, really hurtful?
Sure. Well, first of all kids sometimes come home in tears.
Sure,
they have
whether,
disabilities or not.
exactly.
So, I mean, that's part of growing up, is you learn to defend yourself, and kind of fend that off. But I also think that schools really need to take a very serious approach to bullying. And I think that's part of the equation here, is you need to create an atmosphere in a school where you are a community, and bullying is not tolerated. A place like New York, it is very complicated. And as a journalist for 20 years, I didn't want to sugarcoat this issue. So the film shows not only that inclusion can work and show some of those models, it shows sometimes where inclusion is really a struggle. And that I have respect for any parent who makes a decision that's best for their child. And sometimes that means having the child go to a separate school, but often that's a failure of the school more than it is a fact that that child can't be included.
When you were doing your investigation, Dan, I wonder what sort of misconceptions you uncovered, be it other parents, teachers, administrators, because you do mention it has to start at the top.
Right. I think the biggest problem is the curse of low expectations. So often they say, oh, this child has the intelligence of a 2-year-old. How do people know? There's really no way of knowing until you make sure you have all the right supports and technology and modifications in place to access that child's educational potential. And I think so often we put kids in separate rooms and say, well, they're going to get what they need there, but they're not accessing the general education curriculum, and they're not having time in their neighborhood schools with their peers.
I know you're planning on going wallpapering the country, as it were, going to PTAs to sort of start the dialogue.
Yeah.
Very expensive, I would think. How are you hoping that this all comes to fruition?
You mean getting the film out?
Yes, getting the film out and just getting the dialogue out, that inclusion.
Well, the internet's a wonderful thing, and because of the website, people are visiting that and watching the film trailer, and word is spreading that way. I'm showing it all over the country, the film as well. I think that my hope is that people see this as a civil rights issue, just like civil rights for women voting, for African Americans gaining equal rights. And before Betsy and I had Samuel, we didn't know this was a civil rights issue. It was like this was going on, and we were completely ignorant to it. And now that it's our life, and now that we see how hard it is to access certain places with a wheelchair, and how often people talk down to Samuel as if he's a 2-year-old, and he's an 8-year-old kid with all the interests of 8-year-old kids, of dinosaurs and volcanoes and friends and girlfriends almost, and loves his brother, loves sports. You know, that's what he focuses on. It's not his disability, and I just want people to see him as that complete person and not get so caught up on first impressions because he's in a wheelchair.
Right, and then hopefully treat other people with disabilities the same way.
Right. I think that needs to broaden to the general society, and I think that if we really start to see disability as part of an enrichment of our culture and not something that we need to fix. For a while we always focus on we have to fix Samuel. Finally we realize we just need to accept him as our son for who he is, and his disability is part of who he is.
Dan Habib, thank you so much for joining us, and looking forward to seeing the rest of the film. Of course, to order a copy of Including Samuel and get discussion guide information, go to Dan's website at includingsamuel.com. Thanks for watching GMA Now.